Hey, is this thing on? Hello? Can you hear me now? Why is it we spend more time testing our web meeting software than the applications that we use that drives our business? That's something I wanted to explore today with you guys so we can see what can we do about that. Because it's an interesting problem that I don't think everyone is looking at from our day-to-day view. For those who don't know me, my name's Dana Epp. I'm an offensive security engineer, and I've spent my life, almost 30 years, working and building and breaking software. And as part of that, trying to figure out when and where and how to test and how to bring that into an organization has been something that I know takes time. I also know it's hard to do. And I wanted to talk about what we can do about that because it's very important that we get application security validation right. So to get started, I kind of want to put in perspective where we're at. OPSRAMP has done some research where they found 7 in 10 IT and developer leaders are expecting to accelerate their digital transformation initiatives through COVID. And that kind of makes sense because if you think about it, we have so much more to do to strive to engage our employees and our customers and making them all work together. And that's very hard to do if we don't give them access to these types of applications. But that comes with a lot of risk. I mean, IBM Security has actually came out and said that 52% of the breaches were caused by malicious attacks against applications. And if you look at Verizon's annual report, 43% of the breaches that they investigated were caused by web applications. So it's a key thing that we need to think about as we're rolling out applications in the cloud or into our data centers that we're exposing more to our customers and to our employees in a remote kind of way. So how can we do that? How do we go about accomplishing that? Well, if you know anything about OWASP, that's what we're all about, right? The Open Web Application Security Project. And it was founded back in 2001. And one of the first pieces of guidance that was published was the OWASP Top 10. Right? That was back in 2004. And then they updated it in 2007 based on the fact that so much had been changing and so much was being affected by, we're learning about new types of attack vectors that we could use, and they're becoming more commonplace. The OWASP Top 10 list is meant to spread awareness regarding web security. It's not a standard though, and I think that's something that I think a lot of people miss, and I'm really looking at you, PCI DSS. There's lots of vendors that are coming across and saying we're OWASP 10, Top 10 verified or certified, and that doesn't exist. OWASP doesn't actually certify anybody in that regard. We do publish some standards, but the OWASP Top 10 isn't that, and that was why in 2009, we came out with the ASVS, or the Application Security Verification Standard. Shortly after that, as we were drafting that and getting feedback, the next OWASP Top 10 was published back in 2010, and then again in 2013. By that time, though, we had enough information where we were able to improve the ASVS to not just talk about architecture, but also infrastructure and deployment. And that allowed us to then take feedback and bring that out to the ASVS v3, which was in 2015. So in a matter of 15 years, there was a huge change. Now, 2 years later came the latest version of the OWASP Top 10, right? It's not a comprehensive list of web security risks, but it gives you those top 10, which changed. And if you were to look back at the 2004 or 2007 one and compare it to the 2017 one, there's a lot of changes that occurred on there. The other side is that the OWASP Top 10 doesn't go into a lot of detail about how to fix or prevent these issues. And by the time we came out in 2019, the ASVS v4 became that standard. It is actually now the official OWASP standard for verification of application security, and it actually supersedes the OWASP Top 10. That's why you'll notice they haven't had any major publications of the OWASP Top 10. So knowing that, we can start putting in perspective and break down what ASVS is all about. So when we talk about the OWASP Top 10, they look for 10 types of vulnerabilities, and it kind of assesses against 51 good security controls or application security practices. And as part of that, there's recommendations on doing vulnerability assessments and pen testing. But OWASP official guidance is that the ASVS level 1 is the bare minimum that all applications should be striving for. In other words, the OWASP Top 10 isn't enough. We want everyone looking at ASVS L1 at the very least. It has 131 security controls to look at, which is more than double what the top 10 does. And yes, we still consider vulnerability assessments and pen tests as something to consider, but now we're going to start looking at manual review of things. We're going to be looking at architecture and configuration and logging and documentation, and we may need to engage with developers to understand some of that, which are things you can't always do. But in most cases, you can get a majority of the pen testing done from the ASVS L1 side. But as soon as that's accomplished, we need to be realistic. We need to figure out that there's more to it than just the bare minimums. And most apps should really be focusing on getting to ASVS L2, which is got 267 security controls. There are vulnerability assessments and pen testing, but now it's done in a hybrid mode because you can't automate a lot of the testing and validation that you might be able to do at an L1 or with the OWASP Top 10. But more importantly, and the key component to this is that not only are you going to be looking at your configuration, logging, architecture, documentation, you're also going to start looking at the source code. So you're going to be doing source code analysis to make sure that certain conditions are capable of being accomplished. And then if you have highly sensitive applications that have data from your customers and your business that need to be protected, there is the ASVS L3 for high-risk apps. That has 286 security controls. And again, you're going to do the pen testing and the vulnerability testing, but now you're going to be doing a completely manual review. Nothing should be automated there. I think a better way to look at this, though, would be to put aside the OWASP Top 10 and just look at the ASVS levels themselves. And when we think about it from the applicability, all apps really should be at L1. At level 1, and we start going and looking at the building level area, the configuration, deployment, assurance, and verification tactics, and any assurance and verification that is done on all the output. And we can see that when in building at level 1, we're not doing security architecture and review. There are still secure coding practices and standards and checklists that need to be followed, and we are going to look at how you're doing code review, but we're not looking at the code itself. We are caring about DevSecOps and what those processes are, and hopefully you'll have unit and integration testing that can test these security controls throughout build, deployment, and release. When it comes to assurance and verification, you can use dynamic application security testing and traditional pen testing from the external side, but the reality is that after that, as you go into the L2 and L3, you need to do more hybrid reviews. It's not just a simple pen test anymore. There has to be a lot of manual review and a lot of access to more sensitive data, code, deployments, and in many cases, external pen testing teams aren't capable of going into an L2 or L3 unless you build out a huge amount of consultation trust to give them access to that type of information. When we start talking about how this all works, though, understanding the philosophy of ASVS will kind of help you understand where it comes from and why it's the standard for OWASP. It's a standard for how to verify the security of web applications. It's application independent and development lifecycle independent. So it means it doesn't matter if it's serverless code or a SaaS application, if it's a 3-tier application running in your data center, or if it's running as a container or a set of containers in a public cloud. The ASVS is not concerned with what you're doing there. It's independent of that in a way that allows it to cover the most. It doesn't matter if it's a mobile app that's connecting to APIs, or if it's a web application, or if it's an Electron application embedded into a desktop app. In the end, you'll be able to follow the guidance in ASVS to make sure that you're testing the right things. It defines the requirements that can be applied across web applications without any special interpretation too, which means you don't have to have a ton of security expertise in the entire team to look at ASVS. It means everyone can be involved, from the developers and testers and product managers all the way to the security engineering teams and the tech ops or SaaS ops, cloud ops teams that have to deploy everything. So what questions does ASVS answer for us? Well, if you think about it, it's going to tell us what security features should be built into the required set of security controls. If we know what the standard is, we can understand how to remediate issues by applying the appropriate security features to meet those needs. We can also understand what the reasonable increases in coverage and levels of rigor will be done for verifying the security of our web apps. Depending on the risk that we have, we'll have different levels of risk, and therefore we should be looking at different levels of ASVS. But we can also compare the verification efforts. We can take a look and see during the process of doing the analysis, how are we doing? And if we then partner with external parties, we know we can have them work through the verification efforts to make sure that we understand at each level what's being done, when it's being done, and how it's being measured. And then finally, how much trust can we place in a web application? Imagine a world where the vendor was willing to share their results of their ASVS L2 reports, being able to certify that they have actually went through that effort and have mitigated components into their systems based on the recommendations and guidance that the ASVS is providing for you. It's a very important part of having what's needed. So if we think about it, we've talked about the high-level requirements of the levels, right? And they can be broken down into sub-levels as part of it. There's like a level 1A and a level 1B, but at the end of the day, it's all broken down into detailed requirements that need to be validated. And what's nice about it is, once validated, from a reporting perspective, it's a simple pass-fail. Now, it's easy to go and say you don't want people testing software with this, just a checklist of, did you do this? Did you do this? Because people can, in many ways, fail to be able to do that. But that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that when we have clear guidance on exactly how we want to verify things, it becomes much more clear of what needs to get done. We're not wasting a lot of time in areas that don't matter or into areas that we don't have control over. Give you an example is we like trying to use a positive approach to the verification guidance. So if you think of OWASP Top 10, it might be something like the tester sell shirts for XSS vulnerabilities. But that's not really helpful if you're not an expert that understands that stuff. A better way to approach it is to have guidance that is verify that the application performs input validation and output encoding on all user input. Now, when you're considering that from a test perspective, which one is easier to understand what needs to be done and how to accomplish it? Now, don't get me wrong. If you know what an XSS vulnerability is and you know how to test for that, that may be helpful. But when it comes to things like input validation and output encoding, XSS isn't the only exploit technique that can be used against that. It's possible that you can look at other things by getting to the root of it all. Never trust input data. It just isn't. To kind of put it in perspective, I want to give you an example here. So this is actually cut right directly from the ASVS v4 documentation. So in verification section 7, called error handling and logging verification requirements, there's a subsection, 7.3, which is about log protection requirements. And if you were to look deeper into like 7.3.1, what you would notice is it says, verify that applications appropriately encode user supplied data to prevent log injection. That's very, very clear guidance. And that's then also linked, you can see, to CWE 117, which is the common weakness enumeration guidance from MITRE, which actually helps to explain what that is and how to mitigate it. So if your engineers don't know how do you fix something like that, there's some clear guidance about that, as well as references to CVEs where this may have actually been already exploited in the wild. To give you an example, there several months ago I was working on an engagement where I was able to pollute a parameter in a post, and that gave me the capability to write that to a log, because they took every element and wrote it directly to a log. But that log was also exposed in an administrative context in the web application so that people could see what was in there. And I was able to leverage that because while I didn't have full root access on the server, I had admin access in the multi-tenant, in a single tenant that I had access to. But because I had polluted the logs, I was able to then view the logs, and the server-side renderer executed the code that I happened to have injected, and it gave me a reverse shell, which then gave me full access in the in that particular container, and that also then ultimately gave me access outside the container to the entire infrastructure. And these type of vulnerabilities exist, and if we're not being careful with it, that kind of attack will occur. So being able to know that and know what to do that, things like 732, verify that all events are protected from injection when viewed in the log viewing software, both 3.1 and 3.2 would have prevented me from being able to conduct that attack. And that's something to think about when you're going through there. So now that we've kind of talked about that from a sampling perspective, how do we start? Where do we go from here? That's an interesting question. And I think I would first start by saying we really can't boil the ocean. I think it's irresponsible of us to go and say, you need to go and just get certified to ASVS L3 and make sure that you have accomplished everything. It's just too difficult to be able to jump in that much and try to accomplish everything. But I do have some guidance on how you can get started and move your organization in a way to help strengthen and secure your web applications. The first is to focus on ASVS L1 to begin with. Build out an initial checklist based on that ASVS guidance. And there's a link there to the GitHub repo of someone who's actually produced a really nice Excel spreadsheet to allow you to track this. So they have detailed tabs for each individual verification section and the actual breakdown of the CWE guidance as well as other information. You can then leverage that with the OWASP testing framework guide to combine that together to be able to know what you need to test and how to test in an area. But what I want you to do is to develop a verification plan focusing on a single area or a module or a feature in your application and produce a project schedule. Because start with something small, but something more critical to the web application so that you can understand where you really are. Perform that initial review of the area under test, and then present those findings to all stakeholders. And that's everyone from the developers who are working on those modules, to the testers who are supposedly testing that stuff, to the product managers that are related to that. And after you've looked at it from a perspective, at some point, this needs to get back to the C-level. They need to be able to see the output report, not of the detailed technical side of it, but just from a percentage perspective. How well did you do in accordance with the ASVS L1 level? Because if you can't pass that, you've got a lot of work to do. And of course, you're only testing it in this one small module. It allows you to understand the complexities of what needs to get done and who needs to be part of the conversation when you're looking at what's going on. And then you can develop and execute a remediation strategy and track all this in your defect tracking system like Jira or your DevOps board or whatever you may be using. Verify the fixes and then as they're being made, but then repeat this in different areas. Move on to new modules to get more coverage. And until you've got full coverage at L1, then you can start looking and consider, do you need to strive for a higher ASVS level? Ask all the stakeholders. Once you've went through this process and you got yourself in a place where you're now validated all the software in accordance with the OWASP standards, you have some clear guidance on where you are today and how strong, how safe your application code base truly is. Now, I know you probably said, we have external pen tests done every year. We're comfortable with how our applications are running. We've passed. This makes me facepalm a lot because how many times have you received a pen test report from an external firm, but there's very few impactful findings, or they say you've passed and you just don't feel that may be the case? Or worse yet, you just want to get a positive pen test report to be able to give to your CSO, and not actually want to see how safe this software is. We've been there. We've seen this type of stuff. And I got to tell you, the reality of pen testing that no one wants to talk about, and this is coming from a self-professed pen tester, is that a lot of times pen testers focus on the network and not into the application stack itself. Yes, they're going to go and take a look and see if there's server-based vulnerabilities in the application and the version. They're going to use search exploit and take a look and run vulnerability scanning tools to look for those low-hanging fruits. And that's not a bad thing, but once you've done that once or twice, they're not going to get any more findings on that type of stuff. There's a lack of focus on understanding the application. And usually there's no clearly measurable goals. So what I mean by that is that there's usually a limited scope, so they can't really show full impact if they aren't allowed to pivot deeper. And these engagements are usually time boxed, so they're usually old, they're too late to the party, and they're too short to be useful. Because the report you got a year ago means nothing to the code change you made last week. And then a lot of pen testers are doing this by following some checklist that they got, or the OWASP top 10, or they bought a product that can run the set of tests. And that's not enough. OWASP top 10 is not a standard. The ASVS is. And you can't use external pen testers alone to get past an L1 to an L2. Now, I am not saying you shouldn't use external pen testing. Far from it. But what I am saying is leverage those external pen testers in the way they're meant to be. Make sure they're following your verification plan. From the outside world, as they're looking into the applications, make sure that you have them looking through and validating against all of those verification standards. So in their report, you've got clarity that they have actually tested these type of vulnerabilities against the positive-based system of being able to, did you check all the inputs? Did you look at how logging was done? Did you go through and see how the server was configured? At the end of the day, measurable pen testing, that's quite valuable. It's not about, you must do this in a week. It's about, you need to accomplish all of this, and we want to be able to see those results. And then you can measure and see how they're doing. But a lot of times that may not be enough. So one of the things I want you to consider is maybe looking at bringing in 1 or 2 people to build out your own red team if you don't already have one. Now, there are a lot of benefits to red teaming, and I think it's something that some businesses just aren't thinking about. They have no problem investing in testers and more developers, but do you ever consider investing in people whose job it is to find this stuff? Well, one of the key reasons that this is important is that a good red teamer understands the code, will be able to go deeper into that code to identify problems. And they can look at the problem areas based on the results from the ASVS reporting to be able to determine what are the areas of weakness that they should focus on. Because then they're actually able to look in the areas that aren't under good test, or who aren't passing through good tests to see if there are vulnerabilities there that we need to look deeper into. They're also a fresh set of eyes to look at software and the systems with a different view and a different bias, because they're going to act as the threat actor. Developers write software to work. Pen testers break software to make it work in ways it wasn't intended. They also have the ability to understand impact better from the inside, because they're able to work and discuss with your tech teams and your engineering teams how software is being deployed and managed. They can start looking at how things might be impacted. Things like SSRF that can be done inside, that can be pivoted off into internal systems. It's harder for an external pen tester to be able to know what those systems are and how to reach them. But because they'll be able to know about that, and they have more access to the sensitive information related to that, they'll be able to understand impact much more deeper. But that also means that they can discover weaknesses in dev and test processes, because they'll understand how developers are writing and testing code and how that operations are deploying and managing that. They can also work with your ops team to look at and test the incident plans, because we want to know when things go wrong. Do we have signal to that? Do we know about that? Can we detect indicators of compromise? And will we be able to, ultimately, at the end of the day, be able to bring that forward? Finally, Red Team have the ability to be able to demonstrate the security controls under test. That is a key part of what their job is. And then they can help to justify security spending by being able to demonstrate that they have been able to verify the security controls in place and how they matched up for the blue team that has to monitor and manage that on the ops level, and ultimately can in many ways justify the investment you're going to need to make in having a team dedicated to testing this software. Basically, they're hackers on the inside, on your side. Now, what about crowdsourced security platforms like HackerOne or BugCrowd? You know, these are amazing platforms. They attract some amazing hackers from all around the world, but I'm going to say that you're really putting the cart before the horse. It's all about security maturity. You aren't ready to engage with one of these platforms until you are passing at least ASVS L1. And the reason for that is that if you let loose 20, 50, 100 hackers against your application that can be done as part of these crowdsourced platforms, and you're not ready for it, your triage team will be so overwhelmed and they won't be able to handle the influx of reports that will come in. And quite frankly, it becomes more costly if you don't have that foundation in place that ASVS L1 will give you. But once you have L1 passed and you're moving into L2, you're in a great position to be able to augment your red team and augment your development and testing teams with external platforms like HackerOne or BugCrowd to be able to look at it from a unique perspective, where you have hackers from all around the world with unique skills that are motivated because they only get paid if they find something. But they're focused on actual impactful bugs, not those low-hanging fruit stuff that hopefully you've been able to cover off as part of your ASVS L1. So to recap, at the end of the day, you need to look and consider what needs to be tested and how it's going to be tested. There's nothing wrong with having checklists, but more importantly, what you want is guidance that is clear to the developers, to the testers, to the product managers, and everyone in between on the type of things to improve your security engineering processes, both at the development and operation side, but also in how you build the software and how you deploy the software. So as these digital transformation projects are going on, you have clarity of what's on there. Now, what if you're not building software inside your organization? If you're not working on your own business applications on there, you still can apply ASVS. And you can work with your vendors as the sellers to ask them how they will do with these. I think it's a request that is reasonable to ask. How do you compare as part of ASVS L1? And if they can't answer that, now you can have a more meaningful dialogue to find out why not, because that's important. More and more of us are going to continue to rely on web applications from around the world to host our data, and it's important that everyone involved thinks about it from a security perspective. Thank you very much. There is my socials right there. You can reach me on. Best way to reach me is either going to be pinging me on LinkedIn. You can reach me at my OWASP, dana.app@owasp.org, or at work, dana@vulscan.com. Thank you very much for listening. I will stay around to answer any questions, and hopefully we'll be able to continue on. Thanks.